The stagecoach lurched over the frozen ruts of the Cheyenne road, and Ada Talbot pressed her gloved hand against the window frame, unaware that the man waiting for her at the end of the line was living under a name that was not his own. It was the spring of 1878, and the high plains of Wyoming Territory stretched gray and gold beneath a sky so wide it seemed to swallow the horizon whole. Ada had been riding for 4 days since leaving the railhead at Cheyenne, her trunk lashed to the top of the coach along with 2 mail sacks and a crate of seed corn bound for a mercantile in Larkspur Creek. She was 25 years old, a schoolteacher from Boone County, Missouri, and she had crossed half a continent to marry a man she had met only twice in the flesh, though she had come to know his heart through nearly a year of letters. His name, as far as she knew, was Clement Brooks. She had met him the previous spring when he came through her town on cattle business, staying 3 weeks at the boarding house where she took her supper, and in that short time he had won her with a gentleness she had not expected from a man who wore a colt on his hip and spoke of driving herds through country still thick with danger. He had returned to Wyoming Territory that summer, promising to build a home worth bringing a wife to, and he had written to her every month since, sometimes twice, his letters full of small observations about the land, the cattle, the way the cottonwoods turned color along the creek that ran past his claim. When her father passed that winter, leaving her with little but a modest inheritance and no more reason to stay in Missouri, Clement had sent for her at once, along with enough money for her passage and a promise that a preacher would be waiting. The coach hit a deep rut and threw her against the window, and across from her a broad-shouldered man in a canvas duster reached out to steady the basket on her lap before it could tumble. "Beg your pardon, ma'am," he said. "This road gets worse every year and nobody in the territory seems inclined to fix it." "Thank you," Ada said, righting herself. "I confess I had not expected quite so much excitement on the way to my own wedding." The man smiled, and it changed his whole weathered face, softening the sun-creased lines around his eyes. He introduced himself as Wade Calloway, a rider for the stage company who was riding inside this leg of the journey because his horse had come up lame 2 stations back. He was perhaps 30 years old, dark-haired beneath his hat, with the easy, watchful manner of a man who had spent most of his life outdoors and trusted little that he had not seen for himself. "Larkspur Creek," he said, when she told him her destination. "That is where I am headed as well. I keep a room there when I am not riding the line, and I have taken on some deputy work for the sheriff when he is short-handed, which is most of the time." "Then perhaps you know my fiancé," Ada said, unable to keep the pride from her voice. "Clement Brooks. He has a small ranch along the creek north of town." Something crossed Wade Calloway's face then, so brief and so quickly smoothed away that Ada would not think of it again until many weeks later when she would remember it and understand what it had been. At the time she took it only for a moment's thought. "I know the name," he said carefully. "Good luck to you both." The coach rolled on, and twice more before they reached Larkspur Creek, the driver called down warnings of riders on the ridgeline, and once the horses were spurred to a hard run for nearly a mile before the driver decided the riders were only cowhands moving cattle and not road agents looking for a payroll. Wade Calloway sat forward each time, his hand resting near the rifle propped between his knees, and Ada found herself grateful for his calm, steady presence, though she thought little more of it than she would of any capable traveling companion. They came into Larkspur Creek in the last gold light of a spring evening. The town spread along the banks of the creek that gave it its name, a scattering of clapboard buildings and log structures, a church with a new bell that had been hauled in by freight wagon only the autumn before, and beyond the rooftops the dark shapes of cattle moving on the hills. Ada's heart beat so hard she thought Wade Calloway must surely hear it from across the coach. And then she saw him, standing outside the stage office with his hat in his hands, and every worry of the long journey fell away like dust shaken from a coat. Clement Brooks was tall and lean, with sandy hair that the sun had bleached at the temples, and a face that had grown leaner and more weathered in the year since she had seen him, though his eyes were the same, warm and quick to smile. When she stepped down from the coach, he crossed the space between them in 3 strides and took her hands in both of his, and for a moment neither of them could speak at all. "Ada," he said finally, "I began to think the whole territory had conspired to keep you from me." "It very nearly did," she said, laughing through sudden tears. "There were riders on the ridge not an hour past, and the driver near ran the horses to death getting clear of them. Not road agents, I hope. Cowhands, as it turned out, though Mr. Calloway here did not take any chances." She turned to introduce him, but Wade Calloway had already stepped past them toward the stage office, touching his hat brim to her in farewell, and something in the set of his shoulders made her wonder, only for an instant, whether he had wished to avoid a longer meeting. But Clement was drawing her attention back to himself, gathering her trunk, speaking of the preacher and the small house he had built and the neighbors who were eager to meet her, and the moment passed from her mind entirely. That first evening he took her to the boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Prout, where a room had been kept for her until the wedding, proper and respectable, for Clement Brooks was, whatever else might later be said of him, a man who cared deeply for what was right in the eyes of the town. Over supper he told her of the ranch he had built from nothing, 300 head of cattle now grazing land he had proved up 2 years before, a cabin with real glass windows he had freighted in from Cheyenne at considerable expense, because he wanted her first sight of her new home to be a good one. "I have thought of little else these 12 months but making a life you would be glad to share," he told her, and the sincerity in his voice was not a lie, whatever else about him might have been. Ada slept that night with the window open to the sound of the creek and the distant call of a night bird, and she thought herself the most fortunate woman in the territory. The days that followed passed in a warm blur of preparation. The wedding was set for the 3rd Sunday in May, and the whole town seemed to take an interest in it, for Clement Brooks was well liked in Larkspur Creek, a man who paid his debts and helped his neighbors and had never given anyone cause to doubt him. Mrs. Prout took Ada under her wing and helped her sew a wedding dress from cloth ordered special from Cheyenne, and a young woman named Bertie Sullivan, who ran the town's small dressmaking shop with her aunt, became fast friends with Ada over long afternoons of pinning hems and trading stories. Bertie was 23, quick-tongued and quick to laugh, with red hair she wore in a thick braid and a habit of speaking her mind that had, she confessed, cost her more than one suitor. She had come west from Ohio 3 years before with her aunt after her parents died of fever, and she had made a place for herself in Larkspur Creek through sheer stubborn industry. "You will want to watch that Wade Calloway," Bertie told her one afternoon, threading a needle by the window light. "He rides for the stage line and helps the sheriff besides, and half the girls in this town have set their caps for him, though he seems not to notice a one of them. He was kind to me on the coach," Ada said, "steadied my basket when we hit a bad rut. That sounds like him, kind and close-mouthed as a stone besides. I have known him 2 years, and I could not tell you where he came from before he came here." Bertie shrugged, biting off her thread. "Not that it is any business of mine." Ada thought little of the remark at the time, absorbed as she was in the wedding dress, and the letters she was writing to friends back in Missouri, describing her new home and her new happiness. She did not yet know how much cause she would have, before the month was out, to wonder about men who kept their pasts close and their names uncertain. It was on a Tuesday, 11 days before the wedding, that the federal marshal rode into Larkspur Creek with a leather satchel of wanted notices and a face like weathered stone. His name was Otis Prout, no relation to the widow who kept the boarding house, and he had ridden up from the railhead with 2 deputies and a list of business that took him first to the sheriff's office, and then, as was his custom in every town he passed through, to the wall outside the mercantile, where he tacked up a row of wanted bills for men suspected of crimes across 3 territories. Ada was inside the mercantile at the time, choosing thread for the last of the wedding dress hem, when Bertie came through the door with her face gone pale as chalk. "Ada," she said. "Ada, you had better come look at this." What drew Ada outside was not curiosity so much as the strange, urgent quality in Bertie's voice. And what she saw when she came to stand before the wall of notices stopped her breath entirely. The bill was crudely printed, as such things often were, with a woodcut likeness that might have been any lean-faced man with sandy hair. But beneath the likeness was a name that meant nothing to her, Ezra Vance, and beneath that a list of crimes: robbery of a stage line office in Dakota Territory, fraud against a cattle company in Wyoming Territory, and assault upon a deputy marshal in the Indian Territory, with a reward of $400 offered for information leading to his capture, dead or alive. It was the eyes in the woodcut that stopped her, or perhaps it was only her fear making her see what was not there, for a woodcut likeness could resemble 100 men. But something in the set of the jaw, the particular tilt of the brow, made her stomach drop as though the ground beneath the boardwalk had opened. "It is not him," she said, though she was not certain whom she was trying to convince. "It cannot be him. Clement has never been called anything but Clement in his whole life." "Of course it is not," Bertie said quickly, too quickly. "There must be 100 men in the territory who favor that likeness." But Marshal Prout was still standing nearby, tacking up the last of his notices, and he had heard the name Clement pass between the two women, and something in his manner sharpened at once, the way a hound's ears come up at a familiar scent. "Beg pardon, ladies," he said, stepping closer. "Did I hear you speak the name Clement?" "My fiancé," Ada said, and hated the tremor in her own voice. "Clement Brooks. He ranches north of town along the creek." Marshal Prout studied her for a long moment, and then he looked at the wanted bill on the wall, and then back at her, and something passed behind his eyes that Ada would remember for the rest of her life as the moment the ground truly began to shift beneath her feet. "I would like to speak with your Mr. Brooks," he said, "at his earliest convenience." Word traveled through Larkspur Creek faster than a prairie fire in August. By the time Ada made her way back to the boarding house, her hands still trembling around a length of thread she no longer remembered purchasing, half the town seemed to know that the federal marshal had asked after Clement Brooks by name, and speculation ran ahead of fact the way it always does in small places where everyone knows everyone's business and nothing stays quiet for long. Ada found Clement at his ranch that evening, having ridden out with Bertie's aunt's buggy because she could not bear to wait for morning, and what she found there did nothing to ease her fears. He was packing a saddlebag by lamplight, his face drawn tight and pale, and when she came through the door unannounced he startled so badly he dropped the bag entirely, scattering cartridges and a folded map across the floor. "Ada," his voice came out rough, "you should not have ridden out alone in the dark. Clement, what is happening? Tell me plainly." "There is a wanted bill on the mercantile wall for a man named Ezra Vance, and the marshal asked after you by name not 2 hours past, and now I find you packing to run in the dead of night." For a long moment he said nothing at all, and in that silence Ada felt something inside her chest crack apart, some foundation of certainty she had built her whole coming life upon. "Say something," she said, and her voice broke on the second word. "I am not the man on that bill," he said finally. "Not in the way you fear. I have never robbed a stage office, and I have never raised my hand against a lawman who was not trying to hang me for another man's crimes." "Then why is your name not your name?" He sat down heavily on the edge of the bed, and in the lamplight he looked suddenly older than she had ever seen him, the confident rancher stripped away to something worn and frightened underneath. "My name," he said slowly, "was Ezra Vance before I came to this creek and built a life under a name I chose out of a Bible I found in an abandoned wagon. I did not choose it to hide from justice, Ada. I chose it to hide from my own brother." She sat down across from him, though every instinct told her to run, and she made herself listen, because whatever else she felt in that terrible hour, she still loved him, and love, she had always believed, deserved at least the courtesy of being heard. His brother, he told her, was a man named Silas Vance, older by 6 years, who had raised Ezra after their parents died of cholera on the Kansas plains, when Ezra was no more than 12. Silas had taught him to ride and to shoot and to survive on nothing, and Ezra had followed him into a hard life on the fringes of the law without ever quite understanding, in those early years, how far past the fringes his brother had truly gone. By the time Ezra was old enough to see clearly what Silas's gang was truly about, robbery of stage offices and cattle companies, and once, in a job gone terribly wrong, the shooting of a deputy marshal who had come too close, Ezra had tried to leave. "Silas does not forgive being left," Clement said, and his voice had gone flat and distant, the voice of a man reciting a wound rather than reliving it. "When I tried to ride away from the gang, he told the others I had informed on them to save my own neck, though I never did any such thing. He put my name to crimes I had refused to take part in, so that if I was ever caught, I would hang for his sins as easily as my own, and he would never have to answer for a killing that lies on his hands alone. I ran because I did not believe any court in 3 territories would trouble to sort truth from lie when there was a name and a reward already waiting. So you became Clement Brooks." "I became Clement Brooks because I wanted, more than I have ever wanted anything, to be a man worth marrying. I built this ranch with my own hands. Every dollar in that strongbox was earned honest, driving cattle and breaking horses and doing work no dishonest man would trouble himself with. I did not lie to you about my heart, Ada, not for one single day. I lied only about the name attached to it." Ada sat in the lamplit quiet for a long while, listening to the wind move through the cottonwoods outside, and she thought of every letter he had written her, every kindness he had shown, and she found she did not know in that moment whether love could survive discovering that its very foundation had been built upon a false name. "The marshal will come for you," she said finally. "Running will only make you look guilty of everything on that bill, true or not. I know it. Then you must not run." He looked up at her, something like hope flickering behind the fear in his eyes. "You would stand beside me, even now, knowing what I have told you." "I do not know what I will do," Ada said honestly, for she would not lie to him even in his grief, no matter how her heart ached to comfort him. "But I know that running is the coward's road, and whatever else you are, Clement Brooks, I have never known you to be a coward. Stay, face the marshal. Let us find the truth of this together if you will let me help you." It was not forgiveness, not yet, not fully. But it was something. A hand extended across a gap that had opened suddenly and terribly between them, and Clement took it as though it were the only solid ground left in a world gone entirely to quicksand. The next morning Ada went, before she had even fully decided to do so, to the small office where Wade Calloway kept his deputy duties when he was not riding the stage line, and she found him cleaning a rifle at his desk with the careful, unhurried attention of a man who trusted few things but his own hands. "I need your help," she said, before her courage could fail her, "and I do not know who else in this town would give it to me honestly." Wade Calloway set down the rifle and studied her for a long moment. "You have heard, then, about the wanted bill. You knew. I suspected. There was talk, years back before I came to Larkspur Creek, about a man riding with Silas Vance's gang who was said to have turned against his own brother and paid dear for it. I never had proof, and it was none of my business, and Clement Brooks has been nothing but an honest neighbor to every soul in this town since I have known him. I did not see cause to dig up a grave that was not mine to dig. And now the marshal has dug it up for all of us." He rose, reaching for his hat. "What is it you are asking me, Miss Talbot? I am asking you to help me find the truth of it. Not the truth the wanted bill claims, nor the truth Clement tells out of his own fear, but the truth that a court of law would recognize, whatever it costs to find it. If he is guilty of the worst of what that bill claims, I will not stand beside him at any altar, marshal or no marshal. But if his brother framed him as he says, I mean to see that proven, and I do not know how to begin such a search alone." Wade Calloway was quiet for a moment, turning his hat brim between his fingers, and when he spoke his voice was careful, measured, the voice of a man weighing a decision that mattered more than it appeared to on its surface. "There is a judge in Cheyenne, retired now from the territorial bench, name of Harlan Whitfield, who has made something of a study of Silas Vance's gang over the years, on account of losing a cousin to one of their robberies. If anyone in this territory has records worth trusting on what really happened up in Dakota and down in the Indian Territory, it will be him. It is a 2-day ride. Then I mean to make it. You cannot ride 2 days alone across that country, Miss Talbot, not with Silas Vance's gang still active somewhere in these hills, and not with a wedding 11 days off besides." 10 days now," Ada said, "and I did not ask you to let me ride alone. I asked you to help me." Something shifted in Wade Calloway's expression then, a kind of reluctant respect breaking through his guarded caution. "All right," he said. "I will ride with you to Cheyenne. But I will tell you plainly, Miss Talbot, I am doing this because a wrong done to an innocent man sits poorly with me, whatever name he goes by, and not because I believe every word Clement Brooks has told you. You would do well to keep your eyes as open as your heart on this journey, for both our sakes." "I intend to," Ada said, though she was not entirely certain in that moment that her heart was capable of anything but aching. They rode out the next morning before dawn, Ada in a borrowed pair of riding trousers under her skirt that Bertie had produced without a word of judgment, Wade Calloway leading a second horse laden with supplies enough for the 2-day journey. Clement had wanted to come, had argued long into the previous night that he alone knew the truth of his brother's crimes and ought to be the one to seek out Judge Whitfield, but Ada had refused him outright. "If you ride to Cheyenne and are seen there, you will be arrested before you ever reach the judge's door," she told him. "I am not known to any lawmen in this territory. I can go where you cannot and ask questions you dare not ask yourself. Stay here, Clement. Let the sheriff see you have not run. That alone will speak for you better than any words you could offer a marshal who has already made up his mind." It was a hard 2 days of riding, through country still cold enough at night that Ada was grateful for the heavy coat Wade had insisted she borrow from his own gear, past ranches and lonely line shacks, and once a small band of Arapaho hunters who watched them pass from a distant ridge without approaching. For the territory in those years held an uneasy peace between the tribes confined increasingly to reservation lands and the settlers who continued pressing into what had been, not so many years before, hunting grounds their fathers had ridden freely. Ada found herself thinking, as they rode, of how much injustice this land had already seen long before her own troubles began, and it settled something in her, a kind of humility about her own grief that made her grip the reins a little steadier. Wade Calloway proved a careful and unexpectedly gentle traveling companion, quick to notice when she tired and quicker still to find a sheltered place to camp before the worst of the evening cold set in. On the second night, as they sat by a small fire eating cold biscuits and dried beef, he spoke more of himself than he had in all the weeks she had known him. "I came west after the war," he said, staring into the flames. "Fought for the Union in Missouri and Arkansas, saw things there I do not care to speak of, and when it was done I found I could not sit still in any town back east. There was a restlessness in me that only the open country seemed to answer. I have ridden for stage lines from Kansas to Montana Territory these past 10 years, and taken up deputy work here and there when a sheriff needed an extra gun and I needed a roof. I never found a place that felt like staying until Larkspur Creek." "Why does that place feel different?" He glanced at her, and something in his gaze made her look away first toward the fire. "I could not say precisely," he said. "Perhaps only that the people there have shown me more kindness than most places I have known, your friend Bertie Sullivan not least among them." Ada smiled despite the weight pressing on her heart. "She speaks of you as a man too close-mouthed to court properly. She may be right about that." Wade poked at the fire with a stick, and for a moment the easy warmth between them felt almost enough to forget, briefly, the terrible uncertainty waiting at the end of their journey. "I have not had much practice at courting, Miss Talbot. The life I have led did not leave much room for it." "There is always room for it," Ada said softly, "if a person is brave enough to make it." They reached Cheyenne on the evening of the second day, and Judge Harlan Whitfield proved to be a stooped, sharp-eyed man of perhaps 60 years, who received them in the small study of his home, with the wary courtesy of a man long accustomed to strangers arriving with desperate questions. When Ada explained her purpose, his expression grew grave, and he rose to retrieve a leather folio thick with newspaper clippings and handwritten notes. "Silas Vance," he said, settling back into his chair with the folio open across his knees, "has been a plague upon 3 territories for the better part of 8 years. Dakota, Wyoming, the Indian Territory besides, wherever a payroll or a stage office promised easy money and a fast escape into rough country. I have followed his trail for my own reasons, which need not concern you, and I will tell you plainly, Miss Talbot, that every credible account I have gathered agrees on one point. There was a younger brother who rode with the gang in its early years and left it, under circumstances that were never entirely clear, some years back. The name attached to the worst crimes, the Dakota robbery and the shooting of Deputy Marshal Coyle in the Indian Territory, is Ezra Vance. But I have here a sworn statement, taken 3 years past from a gang member who turned informant before he was hanged in Deadwood, stating plainly that Ezra Vance was not present for either crime, and that Silas himself boasted of using his brother's name to muddy the trail behind him." Ada felt something loosen in her chest, some knot of dread she had been carrying since the moment she first saw that wanted bill upon the mercantile wall. "Then he can be cleared. There is proof." "There is testimony," Judge Whitfield said carefully, "which is a different thing from proof a court will readily accept, particularly testimony from a hanged outlaw with every reason to muddy waters of his own before he died. It would help a great deal if Ezra Vance or Clement Brooks, whichever name he now carries, were willing to testify himself against his brother, and better still if Silas Vance could be captured and brought before a proper court to answer for his own crimes plainly, without another man's name shielding him." "He would testify," Ada said at once. "I know he would if it meant clearing his name and beginning his life honestly at last." Wade Calloway, who had been quiet through most of the exchange, leaned forward now. "Judge, do you have any notion where Silas Vance's gang has been operating of late? If Ezra Vance's whereabouts have become known through that wanted bill posted in Larkspur Creek, it seems to me his brother may hear of it before long, and a man like that would not care to have his old scapegoat testifying against him in open court." Judge Whitfield's face grew grim. "There have been reports, not 2 weeks past, of riders matching Silas Vance's description seen along the rail line north of Cheyenne, moving toward the Wyoming interior. If he has learned that his brother has settled and built a life under a new name, and that a federal marshal has stumbled upon the connection, he may well decide the safest course is to silence the one man who could unmask him for good." The ride back to Larkspur Creek felt longer than the ride out, weighted now with a new and specific fear that had not existed before, and Ada found herself watching every distant rise and stand of cottonwood with a wariness she had never before needed in her life. Wade Calloway rode close beside her the whole way, rifle within easy reach, and though he said little, his silent vigilance was its own kind of comfort. They reached the town on the evening of the 4th day since Ada had first seen the wanted bill, and she went straight to Clement's ranch without pausing even to change from her travel clothes, finding him pacing the small yard in the dusk like a man who had not slept in days. "Judge Whitfield has testimony," she told him, breathless from the ride. "A sworn statement from a hanged gang member confirming you were not present for the Dakota robbery or the shooting in the Indian Territory. But he says it will not be enough alone. You must testify against Silas yourself, and it would be far better still if Silas were captured and made to answer for his own crimes before a proper court." Clement's face, which had lit with hope at her first words, darkened again at the last. Silas will not simply walk into a courtroom and confess, Ada. He has spent 8 years making certain other men's necks stretch for his crimes instead of his own. If he learns I mean to testify, he will come for me first, and he will not come alone or gently. Judge Whitfield believes he may already be riding this way, Wade Calloway said quietly, dismounting beside them. There have been sightings north of Cheyenne, moving into the interior. For a long moment Clement said nothing, staring out at the darkening hills as though he might already see riders approaching upon them. Then he straightened, and something resolute settled into his bearing that Ada had not seen since before the wanted bill had torn their happiness apart. "Then let him come," he said. "I have run from my brother's shadow for 6 years, Ada, built a life and a name, and a love I was terrified to lose the moment anyone looked too closely at where I had come from. I will not run any longer. If Silas means to silence me, let him try it in a town full of witnesses and a lawman's badge nearby, rather than on some lonely stretch of prairie where he can bury the truth along with my body." The next several days passed in a strange, taut quiet, the whole town seeming to sense that something was gathering on the horizon, though only a handful of people knew the full truth of it. Marshal Prout, when Ada and Wade brought him to speak with Judge Whitfield's written statement, proved more reasonable than Ada had dared hope. A man who cared, in the end, more for justice properly done than for the easy satisfaction of an arrest. "I have chased false leads before," he admitted, reading over the judge's folio by lamplight in the sheriff's office. "If your Mr. Brooks is willing to testify formally against his brother, and if we can take Silas Vance alive to answer for his own crimes plainly, I will see the wanted bills against Ezra Vance withdrawn myself, and gladly. I did not become a marshal to hang honest men for the sins of dishonest ones." Sheriff Dunmore, an older man with a bad hip and a shotgun he kept within reach at all times, agreed to deputize half the able-bodied men in town, Wade Calloway among them, in case Silas Vance's gang made good on the threat that hung now over Larkspur Creek like a held breath. Clement, for his part, refused to hide, working his ranch by day and standing watch by night, and Ada found herself, in those tense days, falling in love with him all over again, not with the man of easy letters and gentle courtship she had first known, but with the man who stood his ground against his own terrible past rather than let it define him forever. It was on the 7th night after the wanted bill first appeared, with the wedding now only 3 days off, that Silas Vance and 4 riders came down out of the northern hills toward Larkspur Creek under a moon just past full. They struck first at the edge of town, at the small bank that held, that week, an unusually large sum belonging to a cattle company that had not yet moved its herd money to the railhead, and it was only luck, or perhaps providence, that Wade Calloway had taken to walking the town's edges each night since their return from Cheyenne, restless with the same instinct that had kept him alive through a war and 10 hard years upon the frontier. He heard the horses before he saw them, and he fired a warning shot into the air that sent half the town's men scrambling from their beds with rifles in hand. What followed was chaos of the sort Ada would remember in fragments for the rest of her life, gunfire cracking sharp in the cold night air, shouts echoing between the buildings, the terrified whinny of horses, and somewhere in the middle of it, a man's voice she recognized with a jolt of pure horror as Silas Vance's, calling out for his brother by the name Ezra, demanding he come out and face him or watch the town burn around him. Clement had been at the boarding house that night, having come in to see Ada one last time before the wedding drew too near for such visits to remain proper, and when the shooting began he was on his feet and out the door before Mrs. Prout could so much as light a lamp. Ada followed, heedless of her night clothes, heedless of every warning her own good sense screamed at her, because she could not bear the thought of being safely indoors while the man she loved walked out to face his own brother's gun. She found the street lit strangely by moonlight, and the flare of a lantern someone had dropped and shattered near the mercantile. And there in the open space before the bank stood Silas Vance, older and harder-faced than his brother, flanked by two of his remaining riders. The other two already fled or fallen in the fighting that had already claimed one of the gang's horses, and Ada would later learn, grazed the shoulder of one of the sheriff's deputies. "There you are," Silas called out as Clement stepped into the open, unarmed, his hands raised to show he carried no weapon. "Come to hide behind a badge and a false name, little brother. I always knew you had not the stomach for this life." "I have not the stomach for stealing another man's honest name and pinning my sins upon it, Silas," Clement answered, his voice carrying clear and steady across the moonlit street. "That much is true. I am done running from you. There is a marshal in this town with a sworn statement naming you for the Dakota robbery and Coyle's shooting both, and I mean to stand in a courtroom and swear to the truth of it myself, whatever it costs me." Silas Vance's laugh was ugly, edged with something desperate beneath its bravado. "You will not live to see any courtroom, Ezra." He raised his pistol, and in that terrible frozen instant Ada moved before she had time to think better of it, running out into the open street with a scream torn from somewhere deep in her chest, not to shield Clement with her body, for she was too far and too slow for that, but simply because every part of her refused to stand hidden and watch him die. It was that scream, unexpected and piercing in the tense quiet, that made Silas Vance's aim waver for the half-second Wade Calloway needed. He fired from the mercantile porch where he had taken cover, his shot striking Silas Vance's gun hand and sending the pistol spinning into the dust before a second shot could be loosed. Silas cried out, clutching his ruined hand, and his remaining riders, seeing their leader down and the street now filled with armed townsmen converging from every direction, threw down their own weapons rather than die for a fight already lost. Clement was at Ada's side in an instant, pulling her back from the open street even as the sheriff and his deputies moved in to bind Silas Vance's wounds and clap irons upon him and his surviving men. "You reckless, wonderful woman," Clement said, his voice shaking as he held her. "You might have been killed." "So might you," Ada answered, clinging to him just as hard, "and I found I could not bear to watch it happen without at least trying to stop it." Silas Vance, bleeding and beaten, was in no position that night to deny anything, and in the days that followed, faced with the sworn statement Judge Whitfield had provided, and the plain testimony of his own captured men, who had no more loyalty to a wounded leader than wolves have for a fallen pack mate, he confessed at last, in a bitter, grudging way, to the crimes that had for 6 years hung falsely over his brother's name. Marshal Prout, true to his word, rode personally to see the wanted bills for Ezra Vance withdrawn from postings in all 3 territories, and Judge Whitfield, using what influence remained to him from his years on the territorial bench, helped secure a formal declaration clearing the name entirely, along with quiet acknowledgement from the marshal's own office of how easily an innocent man's name could be ruined by another's cunning, and the law's own haste to close a case. "It is not the first injustice this territory has seen, and I dare say it will not be the last," Judge Whitfield told Ada, when he rode out himself to witness the formal clearing of charges. "Frontier justice moves fast and does not always pause to ask whether the fastest answer is also the truest one. I am glad, in this instance at least, that truth found its way to light before it was too late." Clement Brooks, for that was the name he chose to keep, having built an honest life and an honest reputation under it that he had no wish to abandon now that it was finally, truly his own beyond any shadow of doubt, stood before Ada in the golden light of the 3rd Sunday in May with a heart, at last, unburdened of every secret it had carried. "I want to marry you knowing you have seen the very worst that could be found in my past," he told her, as they stood together outside the little church with its new bell ringing out clear across the creek, "and chosen to stay regardless. I do not know what I did in this life to deserve such loyalty, but I mean to spend every day I have left proving myself worthy of it." "You have already proven it," Ada said, smiling through happy tears. "The night you walked out unarmed to face your own brother rather than let him burn this town to reach you. I do not need any further proof, Clement. I need only you, and the honest name you have earned twice over now." The wedding itself was everything Ada had once imagined and more. The little church filled with nearly the whole town, Mrs. Prout weeping openly in the front pew, Sheriff Dunmore standing at the back with his bad hip, and his shotgun set aside for once in favor of his good Sunday coat. Bertie Sullivan stood beside Ada as her attendant, radiant in a dress of her own careful making, and it did not escape Ada's notice, even amid the joy of her own day, how often Bertie's eyes found Wade Calloway across the small church, nor how often his gaze returned the favor. It was Wade, in fact, who had ridden out that very morning to fetch the traveling preacher from the next settlement over when a spring rain threatened to wash out the usual crossing, arriving back with the preacher soaked to the bone but grinning, having clearly enjoyed the small adventure of it. And it was Wade who stood as Clement's own witness at the altar, the two men having forged, through the fire of the preceding weeks, a friendship neither had expected but both had come to value. After the ceremony, as the town gathered for a celebration on the green beside the creek, fiddles tuning up and long tables groaning under dishes brought by half the households in Larkspur Creek, Ada found a quiet moment to speak with Wade Calloway, who stood somewhat apart from the dancing with a cup of cider in his hand, and an expression she had come to recognize, in their weeks of shared trial, as thoughtful rather than aloof. "You saved his life that night," she said. "And mine besides, if his brother's aim had held steady a moment longer." "I only did what any decent man would have done," Wade said. "You are the one who ran out into gunfire without a thought for your own safety. I do not know that I have ever seen braver folly in all my years on this frontier. It was not folly. It was love, Mr. Calloway, plain and simple, and I think perhaps you understand that better than you let on." She glanced meaningfully across the green, where Bertie Sullivan stood laughing with a group of younger women, her red hair catching the last of the evening sun. "You have ridden 2 hard days with me to Cheyenne and back, stood deputy through a gunfight, and fetched a soaked preacher through spring rain all in the space of little more than a week, Mr. Calloway. I begin to think a man does not go to such lengths for a town alone. I think perhaps he goes to such lengths because there is someone in that town he has grown to care for rather more than he has admitted, even to himself." Wade Calloway's ears went faintly red beneath his hat, and for a moment the careful composure he wore like armor slipped, revealing something younger and more uncertain beneath it. "I have not had the courage to say as much to her directly," he admitted quietly. "A man who has spent as many years alone as I have grows out of practice at such things." "Then perhaps," Ada said gently, "today is as fine a day as any to begin practicing. There is dancing, Mr. Calloway, and a fiddle, and a girl across that green who has watched you rather more than she has watched the music these past few minutes. I do not think courage requires a great deal more than a single first step." It was, in the end, precisely the nudge Wade Calloway needed, for within the hour Ada watched with quiet delight as he crossed the green to where Bertie stood, spoke a few words that made her laugh and then blush in equal measure, and led her out among the dancers as the fiddle struck up a reel that carried clear across the water. Clement, coming to stand beside his new wife with his arms settling warm and familiar around her shoulders, followed her gaze and smiled. "It seems," he said, "that Larkspur Creek may have more than one wedding to celebrate before the year is out." "I rather hope so," Ada said, leaning into him. "There is a great deal of happiness in this world that has been hard won by people who deserve it, Clement. I do not see why we should not wish for as much of it to spread as possible." Wade Calloway and Bertie Sullivan were married that autumn, in the same small church, with Ada standing as Bertie's attendant just as Bertie had once stood for her, and the friendship between the two couples deepened over the following years into something as solid and enduring as the land itself. Wade eventually took on the sheriff's badge full-time when Sheriff Dunmore's bad hip finally forced him into a quieter retirement, and he brought to the role the same careful, thoughtful vigilance that had once helped save Clement's life, keeping Larkspur Creek a safer town for the families who continued to settle there through the years that followed. As for Silas Vance, he was tried the following spring in a proper federal court in Cheyenne, and the weight of his own confessions, along with the testimony of his captured men, and the sworn statements Judge Whitfield had gathered over years of patient effort, secured his conviction on charges that finally, rightly, bore his own name alone. He was sentenced to many years in the territorial prison, and though Clement felt no joy in his brother's downfall, only a weary, sorrowful relief that the long shadow of injustice had finally lifted from his own life, he found he could at last speak of his past without fear, and in time, without shame. The Brooks Ranch prospered in the years that followed, the herd growing from 300 head to nearly 1,000, the small cabin with its glass windows expanding room by room as the family within it grew. Ada gave birth to their first child in the spring of 1880, a son they named Harlan, after the judge whose careful patience had helped clear his father's name, and 2 years later a daughter, Clara, followed by another son, Otis, named with wry affection for the marshal who had chosen justice over the easy satisfaction of a quick arrest. Ada continued to teach for a time in the small schoolhouse, the town built once enough families had settled to need one, and she often told her students, when the lesson turned to matters of right and wrong, that the law of the land was only ever as good as the people willing to look past the easy answer in search of the true one. On quiet evenings, when the cattle were settled and the children asleep, Ada and Clement often sat together on the porch of the home he had built with his own 2 hands, watching the sun set gold and red over hills that had once seemed, for a handful of terrible weeks, poised to tear their happiness apart forever. "I used to fear," Clement told her once, many years into their marriage, his hair beginning to gray at the temples, his hands still strong and sure despite the passing years, "that if you ever learned the truth of who I had been, you would see nothing left of the man you had fallen in love with. That the name Ezra Vance would swallow up everything good you had found in Clement Brooks. I learned long ago," Ada said, resting her head against his shoulder as the first stars came out over the creek that had given their home its name, "that a man is not the sum of the worst lie ever told about him, nor even the worst truth. He is the sum of what he chooses to do once the truth comes to light. You chose honesty, Clement, even when it terrified you. You chose to stand your ground rather than run. That is the man I married, and that is the man I have loved every single day since, whatever name fate once hung upon him." He kissed the top of her head, and out across the darkening hills a night bird called, the same lonesome, lovely sound she remembered from her very first night in Larkspur Creek, when she had been nothing more than a hopeful young woman stepping down from a stagecoach into a future she could not have imagined, for all its trials, would prove so richly, enduringly happy. They lived long lives on that ranch beside the creek, watching their children grow and marry and raise children of their own, watching Wade and Bertie Calloway's family grow alongside theirs in a friendship that never once wavered through 40 years of shared frontier life. And if either Ada or Clement ever looked back upon that terrible spring of 1878, it was only to remember, with quiet gratitude, how very close they had come to losing everything, and how much more precious their happiness had become for having been so nearly lost, and so hard, and so truly won.